Immigration laws began to change after the waves of eager migrants from Europe had run their course and those left behind resigned themselves to the new democratic Europe that came out of the year of revolutions in 1848. And anyone bold enough to come across the ocean already had by the time Prohibition hit, which made up the minds of any Europeans still on the fence about whether or not to come over. The Irish and the Italians didn't blend in America any better than the Germans and the English, but Germans had more loyalty to America than to the old country, and during Hitler's war, the German Americans started calling themselves American Germans. In 1914, President Wilson gave a speech attacking Americans who, quote, need hyphens in their names because only part of them have come over, close quote. The German Americans, page 393. Wilson said that if you lived here long enough, you could drop the hyphen from European American. And right after the Great War, America closed its door to all the dreadful people in Europe, limiting their opportunity in America to 2% immigration precisely because of the horror show of Europe's war in the trenches. By the time of Hitler's war, Europe was still segregated by nationality, with the Germans and the French and the English living apart. And having America help Germany after the Great War had not been welcomed by either the English or the French. During those days when Hitler was dreaming of making Germany Jew-free, Harry Anslinger wanted to make America alcohol-free, and during Prohibition, Anslinger wanted a $1,000 fine and 6 months in jail for buying alcohol, with the second offense costing $5,000 and 2 years in jail. Hitler had only gotten drunk once and ended up sleeping in the cold in a ditch outside of town, and Hitler swore he would never drink again, and he didn't, because his drugs were his medicine. Everyone had pitched in with the debate over beer versus spirits, and the prohibitionists landed a right hook by declaring that the grain used to make beer was needed for the Great War, and when Congress outlawed the use of grain for making alcohol after the war, the German brewers went out of business and their subsequent poverty hardened the bad feelings against them. Before Prohibition, Germans had been laughed at or considered odd or bothersome, but as soon as Prohibition started, Germans became unwanted and in some circles became the enemy all over again. There were isolated areas of Prussian Germans in North Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas, those who had once been invited into Russia by Catherine the Great with a promise of exemption from military service, and when they came over to America, the Germans stuck together, helping each other with the farming skills they'd brought with them, and that was where the bush cutters had come from. When the Great War broke out, American boys started torturing Dachshunds, Schnauzers, Weimaraner, and German Shepherds, which suddenly became Alsatians instead, and General Pershing changed his name from Pershing, and Eisenhower became Eisenhower, and the British royal family became Windsor instead of Battenberg, and the Battenbergs became Mountbattens. On the 16th of April in 1917, President Wilson declared war on Germany. Any intelligent American mechanic could see that if the Europeans hadn't been a lot of ignorant, underpaid foreigners who drank, smoked, and were loose about women and wasteful in their methods of production, the war could never have happened. The Big Money, page 54. The Declaration of Independence had first been published in America in a German-language newspaper, and Benjamin Franklin recorded that of the 6 printing presses in Pennsylvania, 2 were German and another 2 were half German. The German Americans, page 363. The most popular novels ever written were by a German American named Theodor Hermann Albert Dreiser, and German Americans founded the Travelers' Aid Society, and the man who bought Manhattan from the Indians for $24 had been a German sent by the Dutch, and the price included a promise to buy 12,000 pelts. Recruiting for the Great War succeeded in mixing the different nationalities in America, from Italian and Irish gangs in the eastern cities to German and Swedish barons ruling the Midwest, all brought together into army training camps alongside the French hiding out in the South and the English descendants settled in the West. The Great War would succeed in making Americans want to keep out the dreadful people from Europe and limit immigration to 2%, but the primary reason for the U.S. cutting back on immigration in the 20s was because of communism. Red hunts by the U.S. government deported thousands in 1920, while Samuel Gompers warned that the American working man would join the Wobblies if prohibited from drinking beer, and Gompers said that making alcohol illegal would turn all the working people into communists. The IWW got a lot of mileage out of Prohibition because people would join the Wobblies just to get a pint of beer at their meetings, and Gompers testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee that, quote, depriving the American working man of his glass of beer tends to promote industrial unrest and discontent, close quote. Ardent Spirits, The Rise and Fall of Prohibition by John Kobler, New York G.P. Putnam's Sons, 1973, page 337. Everyone had been fighting over the beer or spirits debate when the prohibitionists declared that grain was needed for the Great War, and men wanted to placate their women short of giving them the right to vote, and they thought that by giving in to the women's clamor for prohibition, it would at least keep them out of the workplace. When Russia outlawed the making of alcohol at the beginning of the Great War, it had the propitious effect of everybody rushing to enlist because they were promised a free daily ration of alcohol in the army. Congress was prepared to outlaw the use of grain for making alcohol and beer under the dictum that the Great War needed all the grain America could grow for the war effort, and grain was strictly rationed, and even inferior grain that had been used to make alcohol was now too precious to go towards making beer or whiskey. When the Great War ended, countless government offices had been keeping track of the storing and hoarding of grain, so the prohibitionists simply used the leftover bureaucracy built up during the war for their own purpose of banning the sale and manufacture of alcohol. Prohibition was a natural phenomenon of government workers not wanting to lose their jobs, and so it was an end run. And the extension of the Food Control Bill was brought before the U.S. Congress, introduced on the floor by a Norwegian-American Republican from Minnesota who'd gone to St. Olaf's College. Mr. Volstead was not even against liquor, but had become the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, and he thought the Food Control Bill and its fellow traveler, the Prohibition Amendment, were an important matter of constitutional law. So while few people understood the law that made prohibition legal, the Supreme Court voted 5-4 in favor, and the House debated it for another 3 months and passed it 255 to 136, and then the Senate debated it for a month and passed it with a minor amendment, and this version passed the House 321 to 70 on the 10th of October in 1919. President Wilson came back from signing the Versailles Treaty to be handed the Prohibition law, and Wilson vetoed the Volstead Act, and Congress overrode his veto on the 28th of October, and 2 months after the Great War ended, the 18th Amendment became law on the 16th of January in 1920. Congress had hoped that in passing Prohibition, their constituents would receive the message that God was not dead, despite what had just happened in Europe, and Prohibition was seen at the time as a victory of rural, God-fearing America over the sinful cities. Since the majority of Americans were law-abiding, it wasn't thought that the dry laws would be much of a problem. What alcohol Americans had in storage was quickly consumed as the flu followed the railroads, and alcohol was an excellent medicinal remedy for the flu. 1.5 million Americans had gone overseas, including most of the doctors and nurses, and more people died of the flu in the Great War than in the fighting. The flu virus had already taken hold well before the symptoms appeared, and when the viruses grew to a certain volume they gained a gene that told them to cease working, and that instruction was what the immune system would use against them in the future. These viruses infected and stripped away all tissues in need of repair, so colds and flu were like cleaning closets. But there was an overwhelming amount of closets that needed cleaned in 1920 because of the hardship the Great War had left, everyone weakened. Everybody was already suffering when the flu hit, and people wounded and hungry and homeless were on the move, so the disease spread like the wind, and 600,000 people died of the Great Flu in America. Today, the same percentage of fatalities would be 2 million dead, and while the government initially denied the problem, in many places there were not enough healthy people to bury the dead. The flu was worldwide and killed between 40 and 100 million people, and wearing cloth masks didn't help because the flu virus was so small that it went right through the fabric, and the flu targeted people who were between 20 and 25 years old, and it was so bad that 60 million people could not be accounted for in its wake. It would take 2 weeks to make antibodies for any particular strain of flu virus, and the immune system was not interested in overcoming the initial viral assault, but in preventing it from happening again after the virus had done its job, because those closets had already been cleaned, and the virus was not supposed to kill the host, but was designed to spread itself around a local area for the purpose of killing off mutations. Gene mutations strove to improve traits in species, ever trying for better combinations, as seen in any fish hatch, where the majority of the fry have mutations that become fish food, because over 90% of the eggs are not viable. In the wake of the Great Flu, people in 1920 thought that perhaps God would have some mercy after the flu epidemic if people quit drinking alcohol. The big question at the end of the Great War was how to control people now that God was dead, and the kings and queens of Europe had been dragged off their thrones and were replaced by communism in Russia, and Americans had to make the choice, either to go commie or to find some other way to make people behave, so they opted for Prohibition. Drunks were everywhere now that factories were making huge quantities of alcohol instead of the small homemade batches brewed on farms, and opposing alcohol had been easy because drunken people looked pretty bad in the light of day, and fomenting opposition in the public square could draw large laughing crowds where all anyone needed was a soapbox and a loud voice. Church was interesting enough, but people didn't really think of themselves as sinners, so they opted for pointing out to the more obvious drunks as agents of the devil. An intoxicant was defined as anything having 0.5 to 1% alcohol, and there had been only 7 dry states in 1900. Then New England and North and South Dakota went dry, and people and women wanting to become involved in politics would ask the men in the office what they had done that day to stop the devil. A lady in an old newsreel from 1920 said, "Drinking alcohol interferes with the oxygen-carrying capacity of the red blood corpuscles. Drinking alcohol will give you a green brain, a red nose, a white liver, a black heart, and a yellow streak through and through." Prohibition was supposed to make Americans hard-working and reliable, but instead it turned them into lawbreakers. Universally, the public, the big city masses included, believed the dry law was here to stay and that bootlegging would be virtually nil. That's easy to understand. Historically, we as a nation are law-abiding. As Prohibition approached, the thinking was that no self-respecting man would risk the shameful stigma of arrest just to get a drink. The Dry and Lawless Years by Judge John H. Lyle, New York Dell Publishing, Prentice Hall, 1960, page 45. After the insanity of the Great War, the 20s roared because everyone had come to believe that the government was nuts, so people worked very hard to prevail in the face of government's best efforts to enforce prohibition, something that had not been a popular vote but had been pushed through by politicians only guessing at what the voters wanted. Now people were too busy trying to recover after the Great War to care much at all about the new government bureaucrats on the home front, and politicians were desperate not to lose their jobs in the face of all the soldiers coming back from the Great War looking for work, and jumping on the temperance bandwagon would certainly keep them busy and make them feel useful now that the war was over. The women wanted to keep their men at home with prohibition, away from their drinking clubs and saloons, and alcohol had been taking the blame for interfering with the sanctity of marriage, so prohibition was seen as a solution, but would backfire when women started cutting their hair and seeking out the speakeasies, where tea was served as an alternative for the ladies, but it was not long before the speakeasies dispensed with the tea. They were small and dark and choked with people. The air was so dense with smoke as to water one's eyes. They were an inferno of noise, punctuated by the shrill, drunken laughter of women. The sexes were drinking together in public for the first time, and they weren't holding it well. The Kind of Guy I Am, page 170. The unexpected result of prohibition was that it liberated women from the home as they went out in search of alcohol, and to add to the mayhem in 1920, women were given the vote. When the Great War was over, everybody had a good reason to drink, and the point was to just forget about the war, and breaking the law during Prohibition was as much fun as drinking because the trenches had shown how stupid governments were, so people drank illegal alcohol to spite them, and loyalty shifted from one's superiors to one's fellows, and the definition of virtue during Prohibition was looking out for one's drinking buddies. The people who ran the alcohol factories could get rich selling good alcohol out the back door, and the inspectors could get rich for not noticing those sales, and the supervisors and the police and the lawyers could get rich going along, and they did. So prohibition was great for business, but it was the wrong kind of business. When it came time to rally around the flag and go fight Hitler, FDR seriously wondered if this criminalized nation full of cheaters and schemers was up to the task. The U.S. Congress set up a fund for $2 million and 2,000 agents to enforce prohibition, and 8 years later they were told it would take $300 million, and even then they would probably fail. In 1925, the Prohibition Bureau could not account for at least 10 million gallons of alcohol, enough for a bottle for every man, woman, and child in the country, and they scratched their heads and made big guesses, but the government was simply unable to carry out prohibition, and there were so many people making so much money because of it that nobody wanted to even begin to think about repealing the Prohibition Amendment. Bootleggers rode Harley-Davidson motorcycles in the Prohibition era, and so did the police, so it was usually a contest of skill rather than technology, and the sum total of all the Prohibition raids failed to pay for the cost of confiscating and destroying alcohol. The Democrat in the White House raised taxes to take care of the intoxicated people who remained public drunks, and the police, jails, and hospitals cost plenty, so everyone started paying twice as much income tax, then 4 times as much, and after a few years they were paying 6 times the amount of tax as before Prohibition. Everyone did their damnedest to make prohibition work, except for the people who were drinking alcohol or making money off smuggling and selling it. And many industrial products needed alcohol to manufacture, such as paint and clothing dye and bug spray. So the government licensed some alcohol factories and told them to put poison in it, and that was called adulterated alcohol. 1/5 of all the alcohol made was pure, while 4/5 was deliberately poisoned using phenol or benzol or methyl alcohol or mercuric chloride or sulfuric acid, and then shipped off to the manufacturers that needed alcohol. And within the year, for every year after that, tens of millions of gallons of unadulterated alcohol would go missing. The Cosmo Hair Tonic Company reported that they'd sold a lot more bottles than were actually sold, and they would advertise on billboards and in magazines so the name was kept in the front of everyone's mind, bolstering the myth that their Cosmo Hair Tonic was very popular, and Cosmo would order thousands of gallons of alcohol to make it when they really only needed hundreds. As soon as the private supply dried up, people started sampling the poisoned alcohol. They died by the hundreds, half of them women and children. The Prohibition supporters called them deliberate suicides. In 1927, 12,000 people died of poisoned alcohol. Ardent Spirits, page 310. Stuff was being sold that was called Jake, and it made the legs hurt within 3 or 4 days, and then the fingers would tingle and get numb and then stop working altogether, and then the feet would stop working and people had to quit their jobs. Getting Jake foot sounded so bizarre that people didn't believe it and suspected it was just a made-up story from prohibitionists telling big lies, so people continued to drink bootleg alcohol. The health departments counted tens of thousands of cases, but among the people selling Jake were sheriff's deputies and district attorneys, so it was difficult to stop the sales. There was no cure for Jakefoot, and it was finally found that tricresyl phosphate was in the bad booze, the poison put into the alcohol to keep people from drinking it, and that was the information that the Germans would use to come up with sarin nerve gas during Hitler's war. People thought the reporting about Jakefoot was a conspiracy to keep Prohibition alive for those in government making a great deal of money on unadulterated bootleg liquor store sales, and many of the Americans who died from poisoned alcohol were babies who'd been given a spoonful as medicine. In a free market, wages fall when people are not spending money, and money becomes more valuable when there is less of it available, and the sober minority were profiting from the majority while the majority drank alcohol. And when the consumption and manufacture of alcohol continued to fall during Prohibition, so did wages and prices. The majority wanted something worth buying with their hard-earned money, but with the depressed economy, fewer and fewer commodities were making their way into the marketplace, and Prohibition brought on the Great Depression because people quit wanting to make money to spend on alcohol and on alcohol-related gatherings. Prohibition made farmers quit farming because the lion's share of joy had gone out of life, and without alcohol, people quit their clubs and their granges, and they stopped going out shopping or going out on the town because there just wasn't much of a point to it anymore. The post office handled 1/2 of the letters they had carried before Prohibition, and granges and social clubs vanished, and the rich folks continued to drink and play the stock market, but without the rest of the country coming home to a daily brew, all that paper money had become somewhat meaningless. The stock market crashed because it was thirsty, and people blamed foreigners, especially the Germans. With the stock market crash, Prohibition was doomed, and at the next presidential election, happy days were here again, and Prohibition was repealed on the 5th of December in 1933. The president of the U.S. Brewers Association counseled against, quote, untoward celebration, close quote. Nobody heeded him. At the Anheuser-Busch Brewery in St. Louis, beer capital of the nation, it was like a Hollywood premiere. Floodlights played upon the beer sheds as the first barrels were trundled forth, and 30,000 beer lovers surged toward the company trucks that formed a motorcade 20 blocks long. In Milwaukee, lederhosen-clad celebrants sang Ach du lieber Augustin to the accompaniment of brass bands. A New York barber shop tenor was so infuriated by a fellow singer who muffed the words to Down Where the Wurzburger Flows that he seized him by the collar, shook him hard, and bellowed the correct words in his face. The Rhine by the moonlight's a beautiful sight, imbecile, when the wind whispers low through the trees, 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 not vines, idiot. To show their contempt for near beer, a band of waiters poured the stuff down the sewer. Amid the frenzied bustle, 1.5 million barrels were consumed within the first 24 hours, resulting in a nationwide shortage the following day. Ardent Spirits, page 353. Back in the closing days of 1919, just before Prohibition became law, the bar at the Yale Club, with uncanny foresight, had laid in a 14-year supply of liquor. On December 5, 1933, when Utah became the 36th state to ratify repeal, the prescient Yaleys had good reason to clink their glasses. They had timed it almost to the bottle. Drug Crazy, How We Got Into This Mess, and How We Can Get Out by Mike Gray, New York Random House, 1998, page 72. Unfortunately, people had become accustomed to not drinking in public, and the Granges and the community taverns had dried up and disappeared, and drinking that had gone on in people's barns had become prodigious, causing an increase in farm accidents resulting from intoxication or hangovers. And with the new tractors and the new farm machines driven by gasoline engines, the accidents were horrific and usually involved children. To make matters worse, the many millions of people out of work were not helped by repeal and now stopped looking for work altogether so they could stay busy finding more alcohol to drink. And now that it was legal to drink again, nobody wanted to go back to the farms where work was always available and where grain could be grown to make liquor, since drinking was now accepted as a daily routine rather than a seasonal phenomenon. Instead, people headed for the cities because they wanted to buy alcohol, the kind that came in a heavy bottle with a fancy label, instead of drinking it out of canning jars at home. Bums rode the rails and passed around bottles while heating up cans of beans, all the while complaining about unemployment while farming machinery rusted away back home. What had become of all those illegal stills and all that home brew? What was wrong with staying home and brewing their own? With the New Deal, price control and quotas had stifled the farming industry, and leaving the farm had become the thing to do. And the Depression was exacerbated by the migration of farm people heading to the cities looking for a decent drink, and they came in droves. To further the economic shift in America, returning soldiers didn't want to go back to the farm after seeing Paris, and the government started treating them as willfully misbehaving, irresponsible children. First came the CCC, sending hordes of them off to camps in the wilderness away from any alcohol, and those in the Civilian Conservation Corps were rigidly disciplined and controlled. That seemed to work, so it was on to more and more government programs and an increasing presence of agencies enforcing regulations and devising policy guidelines. As the government tried to whip these worthless drunks into some economic shape, they avoided any laws that would help people get back onto self-sufficient farms, because that was where the drinking had started in the first place. Returning everyone back onto their farms had been a primary goal of the New Deal, but with the snapback from repeal, the government wanted to promote less drunkenness, not a resurgence of the healthy little farms with their healthy little stills.